April 4th, 1968. 6:01 in the evening. The air hung heavy over Memphis, Tennessee, thick with the promise of spring rain. Along Mulberry Street, a quiet residential block just south of downtown, the day was winding down like any other Thursday. Inside the Lorraine Motel, guests moved about their business, unaware that time itself was about to fracture. Then came the sound. A single gunshot cracked through the stillness, sharp and final, echoing off brick walls and concrete walkways. The sound shattered more than just the quiet of an ordinary evening. It shattered hope. It shattered a movement. It shattered America. On the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel, outside room 306, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood talking with friends in the parking lot below. He leaned against the turquoise metal railing, relaxed for one of the few times that week. He had just asked musician Ben Branch to play his favorite hymn, "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," at an upcoming event. His face held a slight smile. The weight he carried, the death threats, the FBI surveillance, the exhaustion of fighting an endless war for justice, all of it seemed to lift for just a moment. Then the bullet found him. The impact threw him backward violently. His body crashed against the balcony floor with a sound that witnesses would never forget. The force of the shot ripped the necktie from around his neck. Blood began to pool, dark and spreading, across the concrete. Reverend Ralph Abernathy, King's closest friend and roommate, rushed from inside. Others followed, their faces frozen in disbelief. Someone grabbed a towel, pressing it against the wound, but it was already too late. The bullet had done its work with ruthless efficiency, tearing through his right jaw, shattering bone, severing his jugular vein and spinal cord, before finally lodging deep in his shoulder. Down in the parking lot, chaos erupted. People screamed, pointing toward a rooming house across the street. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. An ambulance arrived within minutes that felt like hours. Paramedics worked frantically, their hands moving with trained precision, even as their faces showed the truth they already knew. King was loaded onto a stretcher, unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. The ambulance raced through Memphis streets toward St. Joseph Hospital, lights flashing, sirens screaming. Doctors met them at the emergency entrance, and for one desperate hour, they fought to save a life that the nation needed. But some wounds go too deep. At 7:05 that evening, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. The news exploded across America like a second gunshot. Within hours, cities from coast to coast erupted in grief, rage, and violence. But the story of the Lorraine Motel, this modest building that became a monument to tragedy, began long before that terrible moment. To understand why this place matters, why its walls hold such sorrow and significance, we must travel back through time. Back to the beginning. Back to a Memphis that was divided not just by a river, but by the brutal machinery of segregation. In the early 1920s, Memphis sprawled along the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, a city caught between the Old South and something new struggling to be born. Cotton still ruled as king, and the river carried commerce and dreams in equal measure. Downtown streets buzzed with trolley cars, automobile traffic, and the eternal rhythm of commerce. Department stores lined Main Street. Banks stood like temples of prosperity. The Peabody Hotel, with its marble lobby and fountain, represented the pinnacle of Southern elegance. But beneath the surface prosperity, invisible lines carved the city into separate worlds. Jim Crow laws dictated every aspect of daily life for Black Memphians, where you could sit on a streetcar, which water fountain you could drink from, which entrance you could use at a theater, if you were allowed in at all. And most painfully, where you could lay your head at night when traveling through the city. The finest hotels, the comfortable boarding houses, the respectable establishments, all displayed the same cold message. Whites only, no colored. For black travelers passing through Memphis, finding safe lodging was not simply inconvenient. It was dangerous. Stories circulated of black families sleeping in their cars, of musicians forced to spend nights in train stations, of well-dressed professionals humiliated at desk after desk. The building that would become the Lorraine Motel first rose on Mulberry Street around 1924 or 1925, though the exact date remains somewhat unclear in the historical record. It was called the Windsor Hotel back then, a modest two-story structure built from brick, nothing fancy or distinguished. Just 16 rooms arranged in a simple rectangular plan. The architecture was plain, functional, forgettable, the kind of small hotel that dotted American cities by the thousands. In those early years, the Windsor catered exclusively to white guests. The building carried no particular significance. It was ordinary, unremarkable, just another piece of the segregated landscape. But history, as it often does, would choose this unlikely place to make its stand. By the early 1940s, the world was changing in ways both visible and invisible. World War II had pulled millions of Americans into uniform, including thousands of black men who fought for freedom in distant lands while their families faced oppression at home. When those soldiers returned, they came back different. They had seen Paris. They had fought fascism. They had proven their courage and capability. And they were no longer willing to accept second-class citizenship in the country they had risked their lives to defend. The demographics of Memphis were shifting too. The black community, always resilient and creative within the crushing limits of segregation, was growing in size, confidence, and economic power. Black-owned businesses multiplied along Beale Street and in the neighborhoods beyond. Black churches strengthened their role as community anchors. Black families scraped together savings, invested in education, and pushed against the walls that confined them. In 1945, into this changing landscape stepped a man who would alter the course of this building's history. His name was Walter Bailey, and he was a black businessman with vision, determination, and something even more valuable: an understanding of what his community desperately needed. Walter Bailey had not been born into wealth or privilege. He had worked with his hands, saved every dollar carefully, made calculated decisions about when to take risks and when to wait. He understood business, but more importantly, he understood people. He knew what it meant to travel through a hostile world, to search for a place that would simply let you rest without indignity. He had felt that exhaustion, that constant vigilance, that weight of being unwelcome in your own country. By 1945, the old Windsor Hotel had been renamed the Marquette Hotel, though it remained a whites-only establishment. When Walter Bailey learned it was available for purchase, he saw not just a building, but an opportunity to create something his community lacked. A true haven, a place of rest and dignity, a spot on the map where black travelers could breathe easy. The negotiations must have been complex. A black man purchasing a formerly whites-only hotel in the segregated South required not just money, but courage. There would have been whispers, resistance, perhaps even threats. But Walter Bailey was not a man who backed down when he believed in something. When the papers were finally signed and the building changed hands, Walter made his first major decision. He would rename it. The name needed to reflect a new beginning, a transformation from exclusion to embrace. He chose to honor two things he loved deeply, almost desperately: his wife, Lori Catherine Bailey, his partner in every sense of the word, and a song that had captured both their hearts, a jazz standard that seemed to embody everything beautiful and hopeful about love. Sweet Lorraine. Recorded by Nat King Cole, the song floated through radios and jukeboxes, its melody light and tender, its lyrics romantic and wistful. The name felt perfect. The Lorraine Motel. Say it slowly, and it rolls off the tongue like music, like a promise, like a welcome home. But naming it was just the beginning of Walter and Lori's vision. They didn't want to simply own a hotel. They wanted to create an experience, a sanctuary, a home away from home for people who spent their lives being made to feel like strangers in their own land. In an era when Jim Crow laws dictated where Black Americans could sleep, eat, or even drink water, finding safe lodging while traveling was more than just an inconvenience. It was a constant source of anxiety, humiliation, and sometimes danger. Black families planning road trips had to meticulously plan their routes around the availability of welcoming establishments. They couldn't simply pull off the highway when tired and check into the nearest motel. That could mean a slammed door, hostile stares, or worse. To help navigate this cruel geography, a postal worker named Victor Hugo Green published a guidebook starting in the 1930s, the Negro Motorist Green Book. Every year, a new edition appeared, listing hotels, boarding houses, restaurants, gas stations, and other businesses that would serve Black customers. The book was small enough to fit in a glove compartment, and it was essential for safe travel. In many ways, it was a survival manual disguised as a travel guide. Starting in 1952, the Lorraine Motel appeared in those green pages. For Black travelers passing through Memphis, seeing that listing brought immediate relief. It meant safety. It meant respect. It meant dignity. It meant tonight, at least, you could rest. Walter and Lori Bailey didn't just own the Lorraine. They inhabited it, body and soul. They didn't hire managers to run it while they collected checks from a distance. They were there, present, engaged, involved in every detail. Walter often worked the front desk himself, greeting each guest by name, asking about their journey, making sure they felt not just accommodated, but welcomed. Lori supervised the housekeeping with an exacting eye, but her standards came from love, not criticism. She wanted every guest to walk into a room that felt cared for. Fresh linens, perfectly folded. Windows cleaned until they sparkled. Fresh flowers when available, adding a touch of home. In 1955, success demanded growth. Word had spread through the Black community across the South. The Lorraine Motel in Memphis was the place to stay. Comfortable, clean, welcoming. Walter Bailey recognized that he needed to expand or turn away guests who deserved a place to rest. He purchased additional land adjacent to the original building and began construction on a new wing. This addition would hold 16 rooms, built from concrete blocks for durability and economy. The new wing stretched eastward from the original structure, creating more space without losing the intimate feel that made the Lorraine special. But Walter wasn't finished. Over the following years, he continued to improve and expand. A second story was added to parts of the building, bringing the total room count higher. More guest rooms meant more families could find shelter, more travelers could find rest. The transformation accelerated. Walter added a swimming pool, a genuine luxury that most Black travelers had never encountered at a motel. In the segregated South, public pools were either completely off-limits to Black people or operated on degrading separate-day policies. The Lorraine's pool sparkled under the Tennessee sun, open to all guests without restriction, without shame, without that constant weight of being made to feel like an intruder. Children splashed and laughed. Adults relaxed in deck chairs, their faces turned toward the warmth. The pool became more than just a feature. It became a symbol. Walter also modernized the property to accommodate the automobile age. He created drive-up parking spaces right in front of the rooms, so guests could park outside their doors. No more carrying heavy suitcases across large parking lots or through long lobbies. You could pull up, unload, and settle in within minutes. It was convenient, efficient, and exactly what travelers wanted. The Lorraine evolved from a simple hotel into a true motel, designed for the car culture that was transforming America. The architecture of the Lorraine remained modest compared to grand downtown hotels, but it had a warmth that fancy places often lacked. The two-story structure followed the classic motel design of the 1950s and 60s. Long horizontal lines, large plate glass windows that let natural light flood the rooms, exterior walkways along the second floor, protected by metal railings, connecting all the rooms in a continuous path. Open metal stairs zigzagged up from the parking lot to the second floor, their industrial simplicity both functional and honest. The building made no pretense of being something it wasn't. It was straightforward, welcoming, and built to serve. But the Lorraine had one architectural feature that made it absolutely unforgettable, visible from blocks away, impossible to miss. The sign. Rising high above the building, towering over the modest two-story structure, stood a magnificent example of mid-century commercial art. The sign was a beacon, a statement, a celebration. The frame was constructed of turquoise metal, that particular shade of blue-green that defined the 1950s aesthetic, optimistic, and modern. At the very top, a red chevron pointed skyward like an arrow toward progress and possibility. Below that, a large yellow oval held the word Lorraine in flowing black script, elegant and friendly. And beneath that, 5 white circles arranged in a vertical line, each one containing a letter spelling out motel in bold red capitals. M-O-T-E-L. The design style was pure Googie, that space-age architectural movement born in Southern California, characterized by geometric shapes, bright colors, and an exuberant faith in the future. Coffee shops in Los Angeles sported similar signs. Bowling alleys in Phoenix, diners in Las Vegas. But in conservative, traditional Memphis, Tennessee, the Lorraine's sign stood out dramatically. It was modern. It was bold. It was a splash of color and confidence in a city still clinging to the past. You could see that turquoise frame from Beale Street. You could spot those white circles from downtown. The sign announced, in the loudest possible visual voice, that something different was happening here. Something hopeful. Inside the motel, every detail reflected care and consideration. The rooms were simple but thoughtful. Beds with firm mattresses and crisp sheets. Dressers with mirrors. Small closets with wooden hangers. Televisions, as they became affordable, were added to rooms. Air conditioning units, still somewhat rare in the 1950s, hummed in the windows during Memphis's sweltering summers. The bathrooms were clean, with white tile and chrome fixtures. Nothing fancy, but everything worked. Everything was maintained. Everything said, "You matter enough for us to get this right." The cafe at the Lorraine became legendary in its own right, spoken of with reverence by anyone who had eaten there. Lori Bailey presided over the kitchen, with the kind of authority that comes from years of knowing exactly what good food should taste like. Her specialty was fried Mississippi River catfish, and people swore they had never tasted better. The fish came in fresh, cleaned and filleted with care. Lori would coat each piece in her own seasoning blend, a secret recipe that somehow combined salt, pepper, cornmeal, and something else she never quite revealed. The fish would hit the hot oil with a sizzle, the smell filling not just the cafe, but drifting out into the courtyard, making people's stomachs rumble with anticipation. When it emerged, golden brown and crispy, the catfish was tender and flaky inside, perfectly seasoned, the kind of meal that makes you close your eyes and savor every bite. She served it with coleslaw, hush puppies, and sweet tea so cold, the glass sweated in the Memphis heat. Travelers would arrive hungry and tired, and they would leave satisfied, already planning their next visit. The cafe wasn't large, maybe a dozen tables, but it had the warmth of a family kitchen. Lori knew her regulars by name, remembered how they liked their coffee, asked about their children. Walter would often join guests for a cup of coffee, swapping stories, laughing at old jokes, making everyone feel like they were among friends. The cafe served breakfast too, eggs and bacon and grits, toast slathered with butter, strong coffee that cleared the fog of early mornings. It was the kind of place where you lingered, where conversations lasted longer than they needed to because nobody was in a hurry to leave. But what truly made the Lorraine Motel extraordinary, what elevated it from a good establishment to something historic, was the caliber of people who walked through its doors. This wasn't just a place for ordinary travelers, though they were always welcome. This became the destination for Black excellence, the chosen home for the most talented, successful, and culturally significant Black Americans of the era. Musicians traveling to perform on nearby Beale Street, the cradle of the blues, made the Lorraine their headquarters. Louis Armstrong stayed there, his trumpet case leaning against the wall of his room, his gravelly laugh echoing through the halls. Cab Calloway checked in with his trademark style and energy, his presence electric. Nat King Cole, whose voice had helped inspire the motel's name, rested there between performances, his smooth elegance fitting perfectly with the Lorraine's spirit. Sarah Vaughan, with her extraordinary vocal range and jazz sophistication, made herself at home. Aretha Franklin, before she became the undisputed Queen of Soul, stayed at the Lorraine as a young artist still finding her voice. Otis Redding, whose soul music would define an era, relaxed by the pool between recording sessions at nearby Stax Records. Ray Charles, despite his blindness navigating the world with such confidence and genius, found the Lorraine's layout comfortable and its staff helpful without being intrusive. The Staple Singers, that gospel and soul powerhouse family group, treated the motel like a second home. The stories that unfolded within those walls became the stuff of legend. Wilson Pickett, the powerful soul singer, was staying at the Lorraine when inspiration struck. Late one night, unable to sleep, he began working on a melody and lyrics that had been rattling around in his head. By morning, he had written In the Midnight Hour, a song that would become one of the defining hits of 1965, selling millions of copies and establishing Pickett as a major force in soul music. Eddie Floyd had a similar experience at the Lorraine, composing Knock on Wood during his stay. There was something about the place, perhaps the sense of safety and creative freedom it provided, that allowed artists to relax enough for inspiration to flow. Negro League baseball legends also found their way to the Lorraine when they came through Memphis. Satchel Paige, arguably the greatest pitcher who ever lived, though racism kept him from the major leagues until he was past his prime, stayed there. Josh Gibson, whose power hitting earned him the title of the Black Babe Ruth, checked in when the Homestead Grays played in Memphis. Jackie Robinson, the man who broke baseball's color barrier and endured unimaginable hatred to do it, found respect and peace at the Lorraine. These men, giants of their sport, treated like second-class citizens in so many places, could relax at the Lorraine without constantly bracing for insult or danger. But the Lorraine wasn't just for celebrities. Business leaders conducting deals in Memphis stayed there. Preachers attending religious conventions, teachers traveling to education conferences, families visiting relatives, young couples on honeymoons, elderly people visiting grandchildren. The Lorraine welcomed everyone with the same warmth. Walter and Lori Bailey never forgot that every guest deserved dignity, whether they were famous or not, whether they had money or were scraping by. The motel represented something profound and simple at once. In a world designed to diminish and degrade Black Americans at every turn, the Lorraine said loudly and clearly, "You are valuable. You deserve comfort. You deserve beauty. You deserve joy. Your rest matters. Your safety matters. You matter." But even as the civil rights movement began to dismantle segregation, the struggle for dignity and fair treatment continued. By the late 1960s, Memphis was a city on edge. Racial tensions simmered beneath a fragile surface, and in early 1968, those tensions exploded. On February 1st, 1968, two Black sanitation workers, Ecole Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death when their garbage truck malfunctioned. The tragedy was the breaking point for more than 1,300 Black men who worked for the Memphis Department of Public Works. They had endured terrible working conditions for years. On rainy days, Black workers were sent home without pay, while white supervisors stayed on the job and collected their wages. Black workers earned so little. Many of them qualified for welfare and food stamps. They had no place to change clothes, no overtime pay, and faced constant disrespect. The deaths of Cole and Walker proved what they already knew. Their lives were considered worthless. On February 12, 1968, the workers went on strike. They demanded higher wages, safer conditions, and recognition of their union, Local 1733 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. The city's mayor, Henry Loeb, refused to negotiate. He insisted that only he had the power to recognize the union, and he would not use it. The standoff grew ugly. Police sprayed peaceful marchers with mace and tear gas. A 16-year-old boy named Larry Payne was shot and killed by police during a protest. Memphis felt like it was tearing apart. Civil rights leaders took notice. Reverend James Lawson, a powerful voice for nonviolence in Memphis, reached out to his friend and colleague, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. King had been planning the Poor People's Campaign, a massive movement to address economic injustice across racial lines. The Memphis strike fit perfectly with his vision. These weren't just sanitation workers. They were human beings demanding to be treated with dignity. King agreed to come. On March 18, 1968, King arrived in Memphis and addressed a crowd of 25,000 people at the Mason Temple. His words rang out with the moral clarity that had defined his life. "You are demonstrating that we can stick together," he told them. "You are demonstrating that we are all tied in a single garment of destiny, and that if one Black person suffers, if one Black person is down, we are all down." The crowd roared its approval. King promised to return on March 22nd to lead a march through the city. That march, on March 28th, turned chaotic. A group of young protesters broke windows and looted stores. Police responded with violence. King was devastated. His commitment to nonviolence had been undermined. He vowed to return to Memphis to lead a peaceful march, to prove that change could come without destruction. On April 3, 1968, King came back to Memphis. By then, he had been receiving death threats for years. The FBI had harassed him, tapped his phones, and tried to destroy his reputation. Exhaustion weighed on him. That night, he spoke again at the Mason Temple. The speech he gave, later known as "I've Been to the Mountaintop," carried an eerie sense of prophecy. He talked about the struggles ahead, about the need to keep fighting for justice. Then, near the end, his voice softened. "I just want to do God's will," he said, "and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The crowd erupted. They didn't know those would be his last public words. King stayed at the Lorraine Motel during his visits to Memphis. Room 306. He shared it with his close friend and colleague, Reverend Ralph Abernathy. The room was simple: 2 beds, basic furniture, a view of the parking lot below. But King felt comfortable there. The Lorraine had been a haven for the Black community for more than 2 decades. Staying there was a statement. He could have chosen a fancier hotel, especially after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made segregation illegal. But King chose solidarity over luxury. On April 4th, 1968, King spent the day in meetings. He and his team planned the upcoming march, discussed strategy, made phone calls. In the late afternoon, they began getting ready for dinner. A local minister was hosting them at his home for soul food. King stood in his room, checking his tie in the mirror. Around 6 in the evening, he stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, spring arriving slowly in Tennessee. Below in the parking lot, his driver and friends waited by the car. King leaned over the railing, joking with them about the evening's meal. He asked musician Ben Branch to play "Take My Hand, Precious Lord" at an upcoming event. His mood was light. Across Mulberry Street, in a shabby rooming house at 422.5 South Main Street, a man stood in a communal bathroom. He had rented a room earlier that afternoon under the name John Willard. His real name was James Earl Ray, a 40-year-old escaped convict with a history of robbery and racism. He had purchased a Remington 30-06 rifle and a pair of binoculars. He positioned himself in the bathtub, balanced the rifle on the window ledge, and waited. At 6:01, Ray fired. The bullet crossed the distance in less than a second. It struck King on the right side of his face, shattering his jaw, severing his jugular vein and spinal cord before lodging in his shoulder. The impact threw him backward onto the balcony floor. The force of the shot ripped off his necktie. Reverend Abernathy and others rushed out. King was unconscious, blood pooling around him. An ambulance arrived within minutes. He was rushed to St. Joseph Hospital. Doctors worked desperately, but the damage was too severe. At 7:05 that evening, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. News of the assassination spread like wildfire. Across America, cities exploded in grief and rage. Riots broke out in more than 100 cities. Buildings burned, stores were looted, and violence consumed neighborhoods already ravaged by poverty and despair. In Memphis, shock and sorrow gripped the community. The sanitation strike, once a local labor dispute, had become a national tragedy. At the Lorraine Motel, the scene was surreal. Police swarmed the property. Photographers captured every angle. Witnesses were questioned. And in the middle of the chaos, something else happened that would be remembered for decades. Walter Bailey's wife, Lori, suffered a stroke. The stress, the horror, the weight of what had occurred in front of her motel, it was too much. She collapsed that evening and never regained consciousness. 5 days later, on April 9, 1968, The same day as Dr. King's funeral, Lori Catherine Bailey passed away. 2 lives lost, 2 families shattered. Walter Bailey was left alone to carry the burden. He withdrew rooms 306 and 307 from service immediately, turning them into an informal memorial. He preserved everything exactly as it had been. King's bed remained unmade because he had been lying down, feeling unwell earlier in the day. The dishes from the catfish dinner Lori had prepared still sat in the room. A white sheet, the one thrown over King's body after the shooting, was displayed. Lori's high-heeled shoes and library books were placed nearby, silent witnesses to her final day. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference installed a plaque outside room 306. Visitors began coming, standing quietly on the balcony, paying their respects. Meanwhile, the manhunt for James Earl Ray became the largest investigation in FB1 history. Fingerprints found on the rifle and binoculars matched Ray's. He had fled Memphis immediately after the shooting, driving his white Ford Mustang to Atlanta, then on to Canada. Using fake Canadian passports, he flew to London, then Lisbon, then back to London. On June 8, 1968, British authorities arrested him at Heathrow Airport as he tried to board a flight to Brussels. He was extradited to the United States in July. On March 10, 1969, Ray's 41st birthday, he pleaded guilty to the murder of Dr. King. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. 3 days later, he recanted his confession. For the rest of his life, Ray claimed he was innocent, that he had been framed by a mysterious man he called Raoul. Conspiracy theories swirled. The King family themselves eventually came to believe that Ray had not acted alone. But official investigations, including one by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, concluded that Ray fired the shot that killed King. Ray died in prison on April 23, 1998, from liver failure caused by hepatitis C. He was 70 years old. Back in Memphis, the Lorraine Motel struggled to survive. Walter Bailey tried valiantly to keep it running, but the assassination had changed everything. The building was no longer just a motel. It was a shrine, a crime scene, a symbol of loss. Tourists came to see room 306, but regular guests stayed away. The neighborhood around the Lorraine, once vibrant, began to decline as businesses closed and investment dried up. By the late 1970s, Bailey had converted most of the rooms into single-room occupancy units for low-income residents. The motel was fading. In 1982, financial disaster struck. Bailey defaulted on a construction loan of $140,000. The lender moved to foreclose. The Lorraine Motel, this piece of history, was about to be sold at auction and possibly demolished. Local activists were horrified. A group of community leaders formed the Martin Luther King Memphis Memorial Foundation. Their mission was simple: save the Lorraine. On December 5, 1982, the foundation arrived at the courthouse steps for the auction. They had raised $90,000 through donations and a last-minute check from the Sanitation Workers Union. As bidding began, it became clear that wouldn't be enough. The price climbed higher. Just when it seemed lost, Jesse Turner, president of Tri-State Bank, made a bold move. He offered the foundation a $50,000 loan on a handshake. No paperwork, just trust. With $144,000 in hand, the foundation won the auction. The Lorraine was saved. But saving it was only the first step. The foundation, now renamed the Lorraine Civil Rights Museum Foundation, faced a bigger challenge. What should they do with it? Some wanted to restore it as a functioning motel. Others had a different vision. One voice stood out above the rest. Darmy Bailey, a civil rights activist, lawyer, and Memphis native, saw something others didn't. He looked at the Lorraine and saw not just the site of King's death, but the culmination of centuries of struggle. "If we're going to have the site of King's death," he said, "let's use it to tell the world about the whole struggle." Darmy Bailey, no relation to Walter Bailey, had been expelled from Southern University for leading civil rights protests as a student. He'd gone on to earn a law degree from Yale, serve on the Berkeley City Council in California, and return to Memphis to practice law. He was passionate, visionary, and relentless. Under his leadership, the foundation began raising money to transform the Lorraine into something unprecedented: the National Civil Rights Museum. It took years. Darmy Bailey traveled to Nashville to convince Governor Ned McWherter to provide state funding. He worked with the city of Memphis and Shelby County to secure millions more. Architects were hired, plans were drawn. The motel would be preserved, with room 306 kept exactly as it had been. But around it, a modern museum would rise, telling the story of the civil rights movement from slavery through the present day. On January 10, 1988, the motel officially closed to prepare for construction. It was an emotional day. The last remaining tenant was Jacqueline Smith, a housekeeper and desk clerk who had lived at the Lorraine since 1973. When she learned the building was being sold, she barricaded herself in her room, refusing to leave. On March 2, 1988, police forcibly removed her. They carried her out, still sitting in her chair, and placed her belongings on the sidewalk across the street. Jacqueline Smith set up a tent and began a protest that continues to this day, more than 35 years later. She believes the motel should have remained a haven for the poor, not turned into a museum. Her vigil has become part of the Lorraine's story, a reminder that history is never simple. 5 months after the motel closed, on July 7, 1988, Walter Bailey died at age 73. He never saw his motel become a museum, but he had done everything in his power to preserve King's memory. Construction moved forward. The Nashville firm McKissick & McKissick designed a modern addition that would house exhibits while preserving the historic motel structure. On January 27, 1989, a groundbreaking ceremony was held. On July 4, 1991, the museum was dedicated. On September 28, 1991, the National Civil Rights Museum officially opened to the public. The museum exceeded every expectation. Visitors walked through exhibits that traced the journey from slave ships to freedom. They saw recreations of the Montgomery bus boycott, the lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides. They stood in room 306, looking out at the balcony where King fell. They crossed the street to see the rooming house where Ray had fired the shot. The museum didn't just display history, it made you feel it. Darmy Bailey served as the founding president, but within a year he resigned from the board. He felt the museum was focusing too much on history and not enough on activism, on continuing King's work rather than just memorializing it. His departure was controversial, but his legacy was secure. Without his vision and determination, the Lorraine would have been lost. Over the decades, the museum evolved. In 2002, it expanded to include the rooming house across the street. In 2013 and 2014, a $27.5 million renovation added multimedia exhibits, interactive displays, and short films. The museum became more immersive, more powerful, more urgent. Today, the National Civil Rights Museum is one of the most visited sites in Tennessee. Hundreds of thousands of people come each year from around the world. They walk the same halls where musicians once laughed, where families once rested, where history changed forever. Outside room 306, a white wreath still hangs on the turquoise railing, marking the spot where King stood. Two vintage cars, a 1968 Cadillac and a 1959 Dodge, sit in the parking lot just as they did in 1968, frozen in time. The museum tells hard truths. It doesn't shy away from the violence, the hatred, the systems of oppression that made King's work necessary. But it also celebrates resilience, courage, and the power of ordinary people to change the world. The sanitation workers who went on strike are honored. The foot soldiers of the movement are remembered. The ongoing struggle for justice is acknowledged. Across the street, Jacqueline Smith still maintains her protest. She hands out flyers to tourists, explaining her position, asking them to think critically about what the museum represents. Some dismiss her. Others stop to listen. Her presence is a reminder that even well-intentioned efforts can carry unintended consequences. The story of the Lorraine Motel is a story carved in pain and hope, written in blood and tears, but ultimately about something more enduring than tragedy. It's about dreams and their destruction, about the building of sanctuaries in hostile lands. It's about Walter and Lori Bailey, two people who looked at a segregated world and decided to create a pocket of dignity within it. They built more than a motel. They built a statement. They built a refuge. They built hope with brick and mortar and turquoise paint. It's about the musicians and travelers who found not just a room, but a home, a place where they could exhale, where they didn't have to armor themselves against the world's hostility. It's about the sanitation workers who walked off their jobs demanding nothing more radical than fair pay and basic respect, who dared to carry signs that said "I am a man" because the simple assertion of their humanity was still revolutionary. It's about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who could have stayed at a luxury hotel, but chose the Lorraine because solidarity mattered more than comfort, who gave every ounce of his energy and ultimately his life to bend history toward justice. It's about Darmy Bailey, a civil rights warrior who refused to let the site become a parking lot, who envisioned a museum when others saw only ruins, who fought city halls and state capitals and skeptics to make sure this story would be told. And it's about all the people, famous and anonymous, past and present, who have fought and continue fighting for a world where the color of your skin doesn't determine your worth, your safety, or your opportunities. Buildings themselves cannot speak, but they remember in their bones. The Lorraine Motel remembers the sound of laughter floating from the pool on summer afternoons, children splashing while their parents watched from deck chairs, cold drinks sweating in their hands. It remembers the smell of Lori's catfish frying, that perfect combination of crispy and tender that people drove miles to taste. It remembers Louis Armstrong's trumpet echoing from a second-floor room, practicing riffs late into the night. It remembers Aretha Franklin's voice warming up, those scales rising and falling like prayers. It remembers young couples checking in nervous and excited, elderly folks sitting in rockers on the balcony watching the world go by, business people closing deals over coffee in the cafe. The Lorraine remembers the exhaustion of Jim Crow, the constant weight of segregation, but also the joy of community, the power of ownership, the dignity of a space that belonged to Black people and welcomed Black people without condition or qualification. It remembers February evenings when sanitation workers gathered to plan their strike, their voices rising with righteous anger and determination. It remembers March nights when Dr. King sat in room 306, exhausted and haunted by death threats, trying to find the strength to continue. And the Lorraine remembers April 4th, 1968, It remembers the gunshot that split time into before and after. It remembers the screams, the chaos, the blood spreading across concrete. It remembers Walter Bailey on his hands and knees, trying to clean his wife's blood and King's blood from the balcony, preserving every item from the room because he understood instinctively that this place had become sacred ground. It remembers Lori Bailey's collapse, her final stroke, her death 5 days later on the same day King was buried. 2 lives taken, 2 families shattered. The Lorraine remembers the long decline, the conversion to single-room occupancy for the poor, the peeling paint and broken dreams. It remembers the near demolition, the foreclosure auction, the last-minute rescue. It remembers Jacqueline Smith being carried out, still sitting in her chair, refusing to abandon what she believed was her home. It remembers Walter Bailey's death, just months before the museum opened, before he could see his life's work transformed into a monument. And now, transformed into the National Civil Rights Museum. The Lorraine speaks to millions every year. It speaks in exhibits that trace 400 years of struggle from the first enslaved Africans to today's ongoing battles. It speaks through the preserved room 306, where time stopped at 6:01 on an April evening, where King's unmade bed and Abernathy's made one tell a story without words. It speaks through the boarding house across the street, where visitors stand in the bathroom window and look across at the balcony, understanding in that moment the terrible geometry of assassination. The museum says, this pain was real. This struggle cost lives. This history shapes everything about America today. Every inequality, every protest, every hard-won victory, every setback. The work King died for, the dream of true equality, economic justice, the dismantling of systems built on racism, that work is unfinished. The museum doesn't let visitors comfortable in the past. It pushes them toward the present, toward questions about their own time, their own choices, their own complicity or courage. When you stand on that second-floor balcony today, Memphis spreads out before you, changed and yet still changing. The sanitation workers won their strike, but their victory was incomplete. Their pensions inadequate, their struggle requiring new battles decades later. Segregation is illegal, but neighborhoods remain divided. Schools remain unequal, wealth gaps persist and widen. Black Americans have achieved extraordinary things, from the presidency to every field of human endeavor, but they still face disproportionate poverty, police violence, mass incarceration, and the everyday exhaustion of navigating a society that has never fully reckoned with its foundational sin. The Lorraine Motel is no longer just a building of brick and concrete. It has become something more ephemeral and more powerful. It has become memory made solid, pain preserved not to inflict more pain, but to prevent amnesia and inspire action. The turquoise sign still rises above the building, catching eyes from blocks away, announcing that something important happened here, is happening here, will continue to happen here. Walter Bailey once said he wanted the Lorraine to be a place where people felt welcome and seen. Today, more than ever, the Lorraine fulfills that mission. It sees visitors who come in tears. It sees students seeking understanding. It sees activists drawing strength. It sees families teaching children why this place matters. It sees Jacqueline Smith across the street, still protesting after 3 decades, still bearing witness. The dark story of the Lorraine Motel is not just about death. It's about life. About people who insisted on living fully despite systems designed to crush them. About Walter and Lori Bailey building hope. About musicians creating art. About workers demanding dignity. About a preacher who became a prophet. Memphis will never forget April 4th, 1968. The Lorraine Motel will always be where Martin Luther King Jr.'s journey ended. But it's also where countless journeys toward justice begin. Where people decide to do more than remember. Where they commit to act. And in that deep commitment, this grand motel becomes something even more powerful. A monument to the truth that buildings don't make history. People do. And the story continues,